Good morning, all, and welcome to our webinar. We're going to be looking at leading beyond the horizon, strategic foresight, innovation, and influence. I'm Sonia Mohan, and I'm going to be the moderator for today's session. And it's my delight to welcome Max Martina, who's going to be facilitating some other jobs for us. But today he's going to be leading the topic that we are going to be exploring this morning. Welcome, Max.
Pleasure, Sonia. Thank you for having me.
And thank you for those who are going to spend part of your morning with us. Thanks to the tech team. We came over a couple minutes late, but we are all good now. First, before we continue, I do want to acknowledge the concerns that all of us have here about what's happening in the region at the moment. So our colleagues, our friends, our family in the Northern Caribbean, particularly those in Jamaica, who are beginning to feel the brunt of Hurricane Melissa. It seems not enough to say thoughts and prayers, but blessings, and we are hoping for the miracle even at this stage. So we know that there will be some aftermath that we are going to be all involved with, but just wanted to note to the audience that we do have that for top of mind as well. And to those in the Bahamas and Cuba, Hispaniola, again, the Northern Caribbean who are going to be feeling the effects, again, you are top of mind for us, even in a session such as this. So first, let me introduce Max. And I was telling the team that we find the best persons in order to deliver and to co-opt and to partner with us as we fulfill our purpose at the Sagicor Cahill School of Business and Management. Our purpose is to build an ecosystem of leaders who are committed to developing sustainable enterprises first within the region, and of course, having that global reach and global impact. And that is our passion. That is our purpose here at the Sagicor Cahill School of Business and Management. And we find those who are like-minded and who can help us further that purpose and further those goals and partner and work alongside you, whether it's an individual, whether it is a team, whether it's the entire organization, we partner with you in order to do that. We have different levels that through which we do that partnership. Today, we're focusing on our executive leadership. And that's why, Max, because of your experience, decades long experience with us, this is why we have onboarded you with this initiative. It's beyond an initiative, it's more than a project, it's a passion. So let me introduce the audience to you. Max, if you just give me like about a minute and a half, it might not take that long, even though the depth of what you have done is amazing. So Max Martina is president of Cambridge Leadership Associates, the leading consultancy on change leadership, and that was founded at Harvard's Kennedy School of Government. He's also a partner in the executive advisory firm North Singer Group, where he works with the C-suite and board level executives. So well placed to lead a session such as this. His leadership consulting spans both the public and private sectors, and for some examples of that, he's worked extensively with P&E and VC groups, with senior leaders at large corporations and Fortune 500 firms, including PepsiCo, IHG, Microsoft, Pfizer, Intel, and others. And on the public sector side, he's worked with United Nations and ComEd, which is the largest utility district in North America. His work brings him to multiple continents and even here within the region as well, speaking and working regularly with large groups and teams. He's also been featured in a range of media outlets such as CNN, NPR, and MSNBC. He brings a couple of decades worth, you don't look at Max, but a couple of decades worth of corporate management and startup business experience to his decade-long practice of working with execs. In a prior role, he oversaw R&D, startup, growth, and merger of a multi-million-dollar disruptive green technology firm that can serve more than 2 trillion gallons of water in commercial and industrial applications. And sustainability and the use of water and management and so on is very dear to us, Max. So that was a great example to give to our group here. Prior to his tenure as the CEO, Max was an executive in a family-owned portfolio of companies, and he observed a common thread among the successful and occasionally struggling enterprises it oversaw: leadership capacity and change readiness, or lack thereof. And this observation compelled Max to study leadership at Georgetown University and subsequently earn an MPA from Harvard's Kennedy School. He has a passion for supporting individuals, who wish to scale their organizations via effective leadership. And that is born from a strongly held belief that the world needs, now more than ever, the fully engaged and effectively applied talents of change makers everywhere. So, Max and participants, that's a brief on who Max is, and I'm going to turn Max, I'm going to be your moderator. So I'm going to manage the chat and I'm going to manage the Q&A. It's going to be an engaging and interactive session. So if you have a question, if you have a thought, you have a recommendation or nuance, please, audience, don't hesitate to drop it in the chat or drop it in the Q&A as well. And depending on how we're going this afternoon or this morning or this afternoon, depending on where you are, we may be even able to let you engage early with Max. So without further ado, Max, I'm turning it over to you and I'm going to be here supporting you in the background.
Thank you so much, Sonia. What a pleasure to be with you all today. You have a little echo. I don't know if that's true for you, Sonia. Oh, yeah, muting yourself, that helped a lot. Yeah, great. Okay. What a pleasure to be with you all. I always say that I'm a recovering CEO because that work that many of you do, if you're CEOs or senior executives in this call, is some of the hardest work to be done. Maybe second only to being a superintendent of a school district. Yeah, I've worked with many folks in positions of authority, and I have a lot of empathy for the kind of work that you get up to. So we're spending a little bit of time today to reflect aloud around some insights that are near and dear to me. As Sonia mentioned, some of these ideas came out of Harvard's Kennedy School. I'm broadcasting from Seattle, so you'll excuse my coffee. It's still a little bit early here, but I've got that in tow here to keep me going. Peter Drucker called us, everyone on this call, effectively knowledge workers. For those of you who don't know, Peter Drucker is the father of management science, effectively. And he says that we're knowledge workers. And so the opportunity today is to take insight and to reflect on the insight, but ultimately convert that insight into behavior. So converting insight into behavior. And so part of what we're going to talk about today in our brief period is conversion of human behavior in a way that supports a lot of the complexity that our world is facing. I'm going to share my screen with you, and we'll go through a few ideas. So let's start in on this. I want to give you some context for both my work and where I come from. And maybe that is best presented through a historical timeline. As Sonia mentioned, I've seen a lot of complexity and change in the organizations that I've had the privilege of working with. And as I work through complexity and with complicated systems and structures, there's a few insights that emerge, and they're the same insights that you can track throughout human history. So let me share this slide with you. It may be hard to see. A lot of data on this slide. History, by definition, equals change. So this is a simple snapshot, right? Paleolithic age, all the way through the Iron Age, Modern Age, Emerging Age. And if you notice the duration of the ages or epochs of human history, you're going to notice something pretty interesting, that by and large, those epochs are speeding up, right? That the complex societies that we're evolving through humanity are happening at record pace, right? From 70 years and now the emerging age of AI with synthetic and AI quantum computing approaches. We don't know how long this is going to last, right? But if the trend is consistent, it's going to be pretty brief until it gives rise to the next level of growth and innovation. What does this have to do with us? What does this have to do with companies and organizations that we run? Think about this. So for those of you that watch the intro video, if you had a company, a North American company or a global company listed on the S&P 500 index in 1965, the tenure of all companies then was about 33 years. Fast forward to today, it's 15 years today, projected to be 14 years coming very soon. What does that mean? What is the implication of organizations that are not listed for very long, a decade and a half? Well, the implication is that frankly, change is accelerating and it's increasing. What do we do about that? Before we think about that aloud in terms of executive leadership and what that means for us individually, here's a few more statistics to set the stage. So this one shocked me. I found this last year, and I think it's actually faster than this now. But the amount of medical knowledge doubles every 73 days. So with the advent of AI and machine learning, this is actually dropping radically faster than it has been over the last 5, 6 years. Um, 31% of CEOs are fired actually for not managing organizational change well. This is from Forbes. 73% of employees affected by change say they're suffering from moderate to high stress levels. And lastly, 75% of transformation efforts don't deliver the hoped for results. This is from PCG. Wow, right? So we have complexity, change, movement, requisites for innovation, right? Any of you that are executives or CEOs running companies or part of companies that are growing, use the chat space if you would to share with us very high level what are the big complex issues that you're facing today. Is it HR based? Is it AI based? Is it supply chain based? Is it taxation legislation based? Drop in the chat and maybe Sonia can read out some of those responses. I'd like to get a perspective of what you're experiencing in your own enterprises. And here's the question, right? What would you do if you could predict the future? How would that change your business? How would that change your future? Imagine if you were able to predict the date of your own death. We might even think this is not something that I'd like to do, right? And yet I would argue that actually predicting the future becomes one of those skill sets that is extraordinarily powerful and productive from a business lens. And we actually have some tools to be able to do that already in a way. And I'm going to talk about that today in terms of adaptation and adaptive capacity. Sonia, any
Oh,
insights? Yeah.
oh, definitely.
What do we
And
have?
the major trend, and you nailed it, was HR. So Tamara, Daniel nuanced it, HR based, HR, primarily adapting to rapid changes, but also supply chain.
Yeah.
Carter talked about strategizing, the need to strategize differently. Kadeem went back on theme, on trend rather, HR and culture. And we have leadership and accountability. And
Wow.
but the couple said legislative, Jerry said legislative and compliance change, and
Yep.
the rapid changes in technology. And I'm sure trying to now realign technology, and I'm putting this in, but realigning technology with whatever your strategy has been, and now with the development of AI just to complicate things. Tanya, but the theme, the trend, not the theme, the trend is HR culture, and the complex environment that leaders find themselves in and how to adapt to that change.
Yeah, fascinating. What a great poll. What a great sample of this group. So HR themes being a resounding element among others, right? Legislative, AI, technology-driven issues, supply chain. So HR doesn't surprise me. I say HR, human resources, right? So the capacity to leverage, manage, recruit, train, support, scale humans, right? Organizations typically are made of humans. And so this is the space that we work in, right? We work with humans who are on one level both complex and actually quite simple. And so let's talk a little bit about that because from an executive lens and a leadership lens, we want to think about how do we manage humans in the context of complex organizations. So I said that if you had a crystal ball, would you really take it? Would you use it? Would you want to predict the future? In some ways, we actually do have a crystal ball. So take a look at this simple chart, right? This is a chart of what we would call organizational stages. Now, one of the interesting things about these stages, and I've worked with organizations across this range of stages, you'll notice that those bullets beneath those stages, again, we could classify this into 7 stages or 12 stages if we wanted to, but those bullets are by and large behavioral, right? So if we set up a camera in an office or a workspace and we monitored your emails, or we took notes in the halls of your organization, assuming everyone's coming to work these days, we would begin to observe behaviors, right? And we would slot these behaviors against specific stages of organizations. So imagine, seed startup company, venture capital backed early stage company on the left-hand side of this chart, mature enterprise like a GE or maybe even an Oracle on the upper right-hand side of this chart. Now, interestingly, if you're an executive of an organization anywhere along this chart, and you know the fundamental or foundational behaviors of the stages associated with these organizations, you actually have a key to predicting the future. And so we think about this from a behavioral lens, behavior predicting behavior. And so when I work in organizations, if I know simplistically the stage of the organization, the pattern recognition set for me kicks in, and I can begin to match the behavioral bullets of organizations across the time horizon of growth. So if we're running organizations, right? Why is it that we find such a powerful, or I should say, high failure rate of executives that have been pulled from early stage companies to run late stage companies? In other words, why do they fail so often? Conversely, if you take a seasoned executive who's been in a prime or mature enterprise and ask them to run an early stage startup, failure rates also high, 92% within the first 2 years, 94 to 92% within the first 2 years. Why? Well, fundamentally, behaviors do not correspond to the requirements of the organization, right? Imagine filing an expense report in a GE, for example, versus a startup company. Very different things. An expense report is something basic, and yet the systems, processes, and bureaucracy that correspond to that are significant. So one of the things we begin to think about, and this does relate to people, as we're going to see in just a second, as we correlate this to leadership, is that leadership behavior must correspond to the stage of the enterprise we're moving toward. Okay. And so when we think about organizations and their growth trajectories, one of the questions that I often ask is, are the leadership behaviors stage appropriate? Are they appropriate, not necessarily to where we are right now, but to where we're going? And so fundamentally, we begin to think about individual and collective organizational behavior in the context of, is it ripe and is it ready for where we're going? And oftentimes the answer is no. So let's begin to push this boundary a little bit. And Sonia, feel free to interject if there's any questions as we go here. I want us to think about the context of leadership. And we think about this in the framing of probably two or three main definitions. Here's one. Here's the most simplistic, right? That leadership is facilitating the success of other people. Facilitating the success of other people. So at face value, it's a pretty basic definition, right? And for those of us that have had experiences with folks that have made a difference in our lives, we could resonate with this, right? In many cases, if you've had a mentor, a coach, a parent, a teacher, a colleague, someone who's helped you achieve things you didn't think were possible, this definition could apply. And let's break it down very basically, very basic. Number one, to facilitate. So if you think about leadership as a set of behaviors, you've already actually distanced yourself from what is often considered a definition of leadership, which is based around authority structures and authority dynamics. If we think of leadership as a set of behaviors, then in fact, it has very little to do with positional authority. It actually has very little to do with your title. And why is this important? Because you can be the CEO of an organization and actually never deploy the behaviors of leadership. Likewise, you might be lower in an organization, deploy the behaviors of leadership, and actually see tremendous impact to the upper echelons of the enterprise. And so therefore, we have to think about, if we're distinguishing behaviors of leadership from the authority one has in the organization, then what does it actually take to facilitate success? What is success for other people in this context? So I often am a little provocative with audiences because I say things like, no one on this call is a leader. And so if that rubs you the wrong way, then the implication isn't to be offensive. It's to simply isolate this idea that leadership is a set of behaviors. It's distinct from your title and your authority. And again, if that's the case, then it actually opens up action options for us to think about how we engage in systems and structures. What is stage appropriate relative to our own behavior to support the output and growth of others? I'm going to fast forward to a couple slides here that begin to articulate the challenges in our organizations that you highlighted moments ago. What if I also told you that change is not a problem? Right? This might be a controversial statement. And I would ask this in the context of, say, something exciting happening in your life. What if I gave each of you on this call a winning lottery ticket worth $5 million? Would you take it? Ironically, right, if you take that winning lottery ticket, your rates statistically of divorce or separation increase, premature death increases, a whole raft of problematic issues comes from actually taking the lottery winnings, including bankruptcy. So yet most of us would take that ticket, right? And so the ticket represents something that for us seems really significant, something opportunistic, something positive, access to new resources. And everyone here on this call is likely to say, I'll take the chances. I'll take my chances with that winning lottery ticket, right? And so would I, because I think that I can be different, right, from the folks that misuse or abuse that largesse or excess. So therefore, right, if we think about change in that context, change is not actually the problem. If we think deeper about what is the problem, it's actually the loss associated with change that we don't like. And so in organizations, particularly when we're dealing with humans and individuals who are confronting forms of loss or change, oftentimes we're thinking about this, and this is what creates the inertia or the lack of momentum in organizational life. So again, change isn't actually the problem. It's the loss associated with change. Okay. So feel free to comment or ask questions about this. But when I talk about loss, I'm not talking necessarily about material losses. I'm talking about even the psychological or mental or emotional losses, loss of stability, loss of connectivity, loss of positional power, potentially loss of resources, loss of confidence, loss of competence, right? And so ironically, when we're in organizations that are experiencing massive elements of change, particularly external forms of change, then the change represents either current or future risks of loss. So now, if we can identify the real barriers to what movement requires of us in organizational life, we can think about loss as a restrictor. So how do we upend this? How do we convert this instead to something that has meaning and purpose? What if we flip that symbol and we say purpose is greater than loss? What do we have then? When we have purpose, which is greater than loss, we have engagement, we have mission, we have movement, we have excitement, we have enthusiasm. If you look at the world news today, you can think about this in the context of even world events. Our brothers and sisters in Ukraine, for example, laying down their lives potentially for something much greater, right? And extraordinary, right? That we would actually send ourselves to war or go to war, risking our life and our limbs in the context of freedom and independence for a country. So this illustrates this, that the power of human belief when connected to purpose drives extraordinary results in organizations. So where am I going with all of this, right? I've thrown at you some of the themes here. Let's hear from you. One more question. Please populate this in the chat. Is
And
leadership
before you
capacity?
continue, Max,
Yeah, please.
I'm just
Yes,
letting you know that the audience is buying into what you're saying. We have Steve, we have Jerry, we have Carol, and we have Lisa saying there's no perfect leader. We're all a work in
great,
progress. And they're buying into what the redefinition or just the nuanced
great,
view of leadership. And
great.
Steve is agreeing with you. It's not about the change in itself, but persons also do not expect problems to come about due to the change, but problems themselves are needed. And if I can use an example of exercising, the when
That's
you're
correct.
doing the exercise, the strength training, when you're lifting the weights, that's not when progress happens. It's
That's
when the
right.
muscles are torn and rebuilding,
Great.
recovering. It's when you get stronger. So
That's
the
great.
audience is already buying in.
Yeah,
So
great.
looking
Well,
forward
that's
to
helpful,
answering
Sonia.
this question. Yeah.
Wonderful, thank you. That's helpful to know that folks are tracking. It is actually it is controversial to say that no one is a leader, and I know that that's a semantics issue, right? That what we're actually referring to a leader is someone who has positional authority in organizations. And so, a quick comment on that. This wasn't specifically asked, but you can practice leadership with authority or without authority. So the
Mhm.
authority is distinguishing, right? And it's a separate instinct or a separate capacity that gives you access to some things, and in some cases is restrictive. But in the context of how we show up, right, in the HR challenges that some of us are facing, ask this or answer this question if you would in the chat: Is leadership capacity learned or innate? This is a
So
powerful
we have some
question.
answers coming in.
Yeah. What do we have?
Mishka is saying it's a bit of both.
Yeah.
Charmaine is saying also a bit of both. In general, both there's many persons are saying a bit of both, more learned than innate.
Yes.
And the so that is the overwhelming consensus. Although
Yes.
Tamara is saying that it's more learned than innate. Lisa Maria is also saying learned and self-awareness.
Great. Excellent. Great. Okay, great. So if we look at the neurologic research, it's probably a little bit more innate than learned. but it's definitely both. And I certainly wouldn't be doing this work if I didn't think we had agency and the capacity to evolve as humans and to grow. Right,
That's
if that's the
exactly
case,
what Daniel just put in the chat, Max.
yeah, great. We're talking the same language. It's excellent. I love it. So then, in the context of leadership capacity, then, and we're going to start thinking a little bit about, and I'm looking at the clock here. You're going to keep me on task, I hope, Sonia. I want to be sensitive to time, and also open up to some questions. Let's think about what this means for organizations that are in growth mode or trying to move into a direction that is, quote, stage appropriate for the context or the need. Here's a framework I'm going to share with you that actually takes some of the ideas relative to the previous stage of organizational enterprises and now applies this to individuals. So, in the same way we have organizational stages, it turns out we have stages of adult development. So, for some of you on this call who've studied adult development, this is a very simplistic model or approach that helps us think about the appropriate behavior in the context of the organization. And we find that this chart, more than any other, at least from an adult development lens, begins to identify the human behaviors necessary to scale enterprises. And so let me give you just maybe a quick example of a linear career progression. And by the way, this chart is not linear. But for those of you that had jobs out of school, maybe you were in a service industry, for example, or maybe you still are, but maybe on a frontline employee type basis. Um, in those cases, right, the order of the day and the opportunity to be promoted and experience, kudos and rewards came from actually doing your job really well, right? It came from being able to deliver what was required based on the remit of the organization and certainly the role, right? If you're a pizza delivery guy, then you got to be on time and you got to be safe and you've got to be friendly and communicate with customers, right? And if you do that really well, right, then it turns out the organizations are really happy with that, right? And in most cases, organizations will say, great job as a lifeguard, great job as a pizza delivery person. You're doing such a good job. We actually want you to manage others doing that job now, right? And so in organizational life, what happens is that we're rewarded with the responsibility and requirement to do that at large. And so organizations will typically promote us and they'll move us into the stage, whether we're ready for it or not, called the us stage of development. And so in the same way that we can observe organizational behavior based on what is happening within the orgs or enterprises, we can actually look at individual behavior on this chart, right? So in the me stage of development, we have a high interest or skill level in a particular area. There's a need for control, a self-focus, and individuals actually use this language, I, me, and mine. But at the us stage of development, people are using the language us, we, and our. And in this stage of development, we actually require other input. We require we require questions, and we have to give credit to others and recognition to others, right? And so in this process, when individuals are managing teams and organizations at an us level of development, then we're actually much more effective at managing teams. What happens when your team is very successful, right? If you're an individual and you're successful, you're promoted. What happens if your team is very successful? Well, typically we're promoted again, and we're asked to manage teams of teams or divisions within organizations, right? And we are required now to let go. We are required to actually deploy behaviors that are completely unlike anything we did to start our career. So think about this, team, right? The organizational requires us as we scale and grow to increasingly become less self-focused. All right. So here's the paradox of leadership. I'm going to explore this in the last couple of slides as we think about our own behavior in organizations as it relates to leadership. On the left-hand side of this chart, right, where the focus is on myself, my tactical execution, my output, all critical things in organizations, right, where we get credit and are rewarded, at least psychologically, for the output and the production that we create, versus the right side of this chart, right, where not only are you more responsible, right, but you actually get attacked or misaligned, maligned, I should say, for things that you have no control over, right? So on the one hand, in the me stage, we get credit and kudos, psychological credit and kudos, and functionally we have less responsibility relative to the organization at large. And on the right-hand side of this chart, we have more responsibility. We're in charge of more people, outcomes, and organizations, and the psychological kudos are less. So we call this the paradox of leadership, right? More responsibility, fewer rewards, less responsibility, more rewards. And in this context, we begin to ask ourselves, why would anyone want to do this thing called leadership? And how do we move from stage to stage to support organizational growth? And what happens if the organization requires someone to let go to manage employees, but the manager in charge is a me-centric individual? So we begin to see why, in many cases in organizations, we have the wrong folks in the wrong seats, leading to perhaps some of the HR issues that you're discussing, right? Developmentally, we have me-centric or us-centric individuals in positions that require letting go and transferring. So really difficult to execute an alignment structure that has individuals' highest and best use place not only in their own developmental trajectory, but in the organizational trajectory that supports change and movement. Now, interestingly, we have done statistical research on how many folks we have in each of these categories. And in the Western world, about 74% of the population inhabits or lives in, demonstrates behavior in one of those first two categories, me and us. About 26% of the population is in the letting go phase, and less than 0.1% of people are in transferring. Now, I've had the great privilege, I've counted about 5,000 executives that I've had the privilege of working with, and I can count on two hands now, 6 people in that transferring category. And so the behaviors that you see are extraordinarily different, and yet they're tremendously powerful for not only predicting the future, but helping organizations and companies scale and grow into the domain and future that they want.
So,
So,
Max,
yes,
before you
please,
continue,
Sonia,
then I have a question for the
please.
organizations so that we would deem successful for those who are able to adapt to the challenges, particularly the ones that were unforeseen,
Yeah.
and they still were able to get out on the other side while protecting the organization to be able to, progress. How many
Yes.
of those, what percentage of those types of leaders are in the last two stages versus the first two?
Yes. So interestingly, just because we find ourselves developmentally as executives or quote leaders in positions of authority, practicing leadership, doesn't mean that we can always convert organizations, because organizations have massive structures, right? They have systems, people, and processes that are often legacy, and they have histories, and they have traditions and patterned behaviors. And so a concerted effort for folks that are in the letting go or transferring stage that are actually converting these organizations takes time. And so one of the challenges we see is that for folks that are in the letting go and transferring stage, they don't give it enough time, right? Organizational culture change can take minimum 2 years, usually more like 3 years, if you have commitment from the top, right? And oftentimes it can take upwards of 7 or 8 years. So commitment to that change process requires that we stick with it, that it's accretive, that it's layered, that it's persistent. All of the same things that make us stronger at the gym, it turns out, right? So if we think about units of analysis, individual, organization, or team and organization, then unfortunately, a lot of the executives that are on this developmental journey don't give it enough effort, focus, or time in their organizations at large. And so part of my message is stick with it. Continue to engage the muscles of the organization that stretch and change. And so as we wrap here, Sonia, before we go to questions, I have 2 more ideas. And one is that fundamentally, this experience of change is like a pressure cooker. So if anyone has used a pressure cooker before, you can probably resonate with this imagery, right? The idea that, wow, you can cook a roast or a steak in, 1/10 the time or 1/4 of the time that you could in a traditional convection oven, right? And it's amazing. It's an amazing tool if you like to cook. But if the vessel itself exceeds the recommended pressure, right? Unfortunately, this could be a problem. It can be explosive. It can be a bomb. There can be casualties. And so a pressure cooker is both a powerful tool, but also a self-limiting condition based on ambient conditions. And so organizations we find consistently are a pressure cooking vessel in a way, right? I worked with the U.S. government in their GSA, General Services Administration office, for a couple of years, and consistently the pressure in that organization was very, 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 very low, very low. Real work, change was not forthcoming, right? I also work in organizations where pressure, stress are extremely high, and perhaps it's higher than the recommended limit, and you have turnover, you have attrition, you have culture disruption, you have really difficult environments to make change. So one of the issues that we think about when it comes to change and managing change, I'm going to skip forward here a little bit, is this idea of a productive zone of disequilibrium. And I'll end on this slide here because I'm looking at the time. The idea that if we want to be change agents in the context of our organizations, right? Then we're thinking about what is the stage appropriate behavior that we need and that we're moving towards. And how do I stretch people's capacity sufficiently to move in that direction? So Sonia, you gave the metaphor of exercise in the gym. And I love that metaphor. And it's more than a metaphor, right? It's an actual prescription on how to move organizations, at least, and if you're talking about the gym, our bodies to a place of greater health. And that is that we have to actually stretch our muscle fibers. If you wanted to run a marathon and you hired a running coach, and the running coach said, I'd like you to, for the next 6 months, every day, walk around your house one time to achieve your marathon target time. Chances are you would not achieve your marathon target time, right? Conversely, if your running coach said to you, okay, day one, Monday morning, we're going to run a 76-mile ultra marathon. It'd be dangerous. You'd tear your Achilles. That would be problematic. You couldn't do it, right? So part of what we need to do in organizations is actually stimulate, disrupt, stretch, challenge at a rate that the system can sustain. And the irony and the challenge of this as executives and senior leaders is that this rate of sustaining is different for not only every individual, but for every system. And so we have to sense and deeply listen to the container and the environment, the holding environment that we create. Part of our work is creating a holding environment that can tolerate more heat and ambiguity. And part of it is helping people stretch their own capacity to move in that place. Now, part of the work that we do with organizations and individuals is to then take these insights and to say, okay, well, how do you practice that? What is a leadership behavior in the context of your environment to help move the organization forward? I'm going to show you, as I skip forward, because we have way too many slides, this idea of, if I have it, maybe I don't, leadership practices. Here we go. Here's a simple list, and I'm filling your screen with this, right? And you say, well, what are these things? And what is this? This is a partial list, by the way. It's a list of the things that we have to become proficient at to be effective in stretching the container, in building sufficient heat so that our organizations can adapt to the pressures of the environment. So I'll pick two here, right? Give the work back. This is akin to letting go, right? Ensuring that the people who have the remit to do the work are doing the work and that they stretch it forward into new levels of person capacity and ability. Here's another one. Get on the balcony. Are we taking time out to understand the systemic level dynamics of the organization, right? And these are practices of a lifetime, ironically. These are things that we can develop, get better at, even incrementally, in the same way that we might change culture over the span of a 5 or 6 year period. So we've just scratched the surface on some of the ideas of what it takes to build our own leadership practice to support stage appropriate behavior. But if we do this, if we have a commitment to this journey, and we can effectively go from me or us to letting go and transferring, then what we are by definition doing is building new capacity in organizations. We become both resilient individually, and we develop organizations that can tackle future challenges. Some generic stuff there. Hopefully, we can get into some maybe more specific ideas or questions that you might have here, Sonia. I feel like I should come up for air and just give a brief pause in case anyone has ideas or questions they'd like to chime in on.
Well, again, a lot of buy-in from the chat. Diane also observed that, and Lisa first observed, what brought you here to the position of leadership and authority will not necessarily take you to the next step. And I know that's one of the areas, about 4 years ago when we started this particular journey, that identifying that execs also needed the support and the ability to retool and to understand the environment they were in, to network and to build their own capacities, that having attained, for example, the pinnacle in the organization did not mean that you were not able to learn. And that recognizing that, providing the supporting and the tools necessary for the execs in the organization. And
Sonia, can I add to that real quickly?
sure.
Sorry. So that's a powerful insight. What got you here is insufficient to get you there. And if we think about what this journey requires, which is why University of West Indies is so powerful in this regard, part of what the journey actually entitles or requires us, not only individually but organizationally, if we're building what we call adaptive capacity, then fundamentally we are creating systems that learn. We are creating organizational systems, organisms in a way, groups of people making decisions that learn and can integrate behavior. So if we can do it within ourselves, we can do it within our systems. So fundamentally, organizations that can, quote, predict the future and adapt, flex to the new stresses and pressures, are systems and individuals that have integrated learning. That's such a great insight by that contributor. Thank you. What got you here won't get you there. And so what gets us there is the integrated learning. Good insight. Yeah. Thank you.
Right. Part of the HR challenge is that those
Yeah.
who are really good technically, great workers, do not necessarily translate what you were talking about when we promote them outside of their area of expertise, don't necessarily make good leaders.
That's right. Spot on. And unfortunately, the way we promote people is based more on, I say unfortunately, there's some good about this, but we look at results, right? We look at bottom line or top line results and we say, well, that's the promotion criteria. When the promotion criteria for managing individuals, teams, and systems is actually behavioral in a different way. And so if we could actually analyze those behaviors, then we would actually find better fit. We would used to do and still do sometimes some pre-assessment due diligence work for private equity organizations looking to purchase companies. And what those organizations, private equity companies specifically want to know is not whether this executive is good at, say, 50 million in revenue or 100 million in revenue, but whether that executive can grow the organization from 50 million to 150 million. And so what they're assessing is the capacity for future state behavior, not current results. And so that's part of our HR challenge. Spot on. Yeah.
Exactly. And Mikey is talking about building capacity, sort of EQ, what we were looking at the EQ literature and so on,
Yes.
building capacity and others. So when you get to the transferring stage, means trading control for legacy. And I love that phrase, that.
Oh, beautiful. Great insight. And in fact, I might riff on this for a second if I can find the slide. It's the idea that, pardon me if I'm making you dizzy.
Ah,
This idea, great segue, that, and if we look at the stages of human intelligence, right, where IQ was developed in the 20s by a German psychologist called the intelligence quotient.
mhm.
And then in the 50s, actually more like 70s, emotional intelligence became a field of study, suggesting that in fact human capacity was shaped by our attention and ability to communicate, not just our raw intellectual horsepower, which surfaced in the nuclear era and the computer age. We're finding there's a third tier of intelligence, which we call adaptive capacity. And adaptive capacity is nuanced. It's different from emotional intelligence, although every stage higher builds on the foundations before it. So adaptive capacity, individuals with high adaptive capacity not only can endure stress, but they cultivate the learning to see things in new ways. They can think structurally. They can convert insight that stimulates new behaviors or learning in others. So are we assessing the people that have succeeded on the front lines of the foundations of our company? Are we assessing their ability to do this? Because if they can do this, chances are they can grow or scale into executive leadership in a way that really changes cultures and organizations. What a great segue to highlight this slide. Yeah, excellent. Other thoughts or questions, comments?
Other thoughts?
Yeah.
I'm seeing a colleague here, Mike Campbell. He's from our Faculty of Medical Sciences, and he said he's struck by the parallels for supervising and mentoring research and clinical students. For example, the PhD candidates and the medical residents. And I can see those parallels even when you put up this slide. See those
Absolutely.
parallels as
Absolutely.
well. And now I
Yeah,
have two questions for you.
great.
One is coming from Jerry. I'm just trying to find the question. Would you say the pace of change is outstripping traditional planning cycles? And
Yes.
what frameworks or mindsets do you think are important in this environment? I rephrase the last piece. Yeah.
Yeah, great question. Short answer is yes. I think the pace of change is accelerating so quickly that organizations that do not proactivate around learning integration, unfortunately, see uh, problematic results both in their financials but also their capacity to adapt. I mean, if we look at I have hundreds of business examples, but think about a couple, right? Digital Equipment Corporation in the 80s, 70s, and 80s banked on the mainframe as being the future of computers, right? And it turns out that a couple other upstarts, IBM was actually quite big back then, but Apple Computer and this
Mhm.
company called Microsoft said no, and everyone's going to have an individual computer and a laptop or a machine, right? And Digital Equipment Corporation said no, we
Nah.
no way, right? No way. Fast forward to Sears, a company that's been around for 130 years, right? Kmart, the inability to adapt to the internet. And then a powerful example, right? Netflix. As recently as I think it was about 5 years, 6 years ago, pre-pandemic, they had a business where they would mail CDs through their post, right? And you'd get the CD, the disc to watch your movie, and you'd send it back in the mail. And they said, "Oh no, the future is streaming." And the internal executive conversation was actually incredibly difficult if you look at the notes, because the conversation was around if we go in the direction of streaming, we will cannibalize our entire business, which was sending CDs in the mail, right? So they actually had to integrate learning at a rate that they knew was going to be disruptive to short-term revenue. And had they not done that, right, they would have missed the boat. So some counter examples of the power of innovation in the context of taking risk. And so part of this conversation, Sonia, really is about planning cycles in their confrontation of risk. And so organizations that use traditional, and I would say it's not so much the cycle in terms of when, it's really more the how, which is to say, how do we leverage
Mm.
risk in the context of our innovation strategy and innovation portfolio? Amazon, I'm living in Seattle or near Seattle, and for those of you that know Amazon, like them or hate them, 800-pound gorilla. They are an organization that has been known to create uh, disruptive conversations, that they allow
Mhm.
for conversations to support innovation. They have this process whereby anyone who has an idea writes a one-page executive summary, and the executive ancillary or side executives that are responsible meet in a room and they tear it to shreds for an hour or 2 hours, and then they make a decision, right? So they actually stimulate difficult conversations to support innovation. And many of us don't want to do that. Many of us are afraid of conflict, or we think the conflict is challenging. But the reality is, right, if we liken conflict to fire and you rub two sticks together, eventually you'll have fire. And fire can be used to warm you and cook a meal, but it can also burn down your house. So how do we leverage conflict in a constructive way becomes the critical need in organizational planning cycles. Yeah, great question.
And two more questions. I'm
Sure.
seeing a
We've
third
got
probably
time.
coming in, but we may not have time to address all three.
Okay. Yes.
And it is about behaviors again. And
Yes.
this one came from Daniel. I'm just trying to pull it back up. How do you address the distrust or mistrust resulting from previous leadership who have moved away from the organization but left
Yeah.
cultures and may put toxic cultures aligned to individualistic focus and resistance to dialogue and change? How do you heal those organizations so they can progress? Again, my nuance. Daniel, sorry for bastardizing your question.
Daniel, great question. I could write a book with the 50 or 60 examples I have on that exact question. Obviously, the nuances and the specifics of your organization are going to be unique to you, to the industry, to the geography. And so there's no single clear answer unless you and I spend some time offline. But the short story is that what happens in organizations often is that employees, I say the system itself leverages historical narratives to make future decisions. And so oftentimes, if you have legacy leadership of an individual, for example, that comes in or that has left, been incredibly disruptive, individualistic, authority-based,
Mm.
hierarchical control, making critical decisions, creating challenging cultures that are not optimizing for workplace conditions or performance. You create a culture where that is the norm. And so one of the critical things for new leadership to do when they come in is to very quickly gravitate towards and amplify purpose. And one of the big things that happens, let's see if I think I have another slide on this. Yeah, here we go. One of the things that happens in organizations is when we feel loss, we tend to avoid the work, right? So, for example, an employee in this context might fear the loss of a new leader or a new executive coming in, making radical changes that will disrupt them. So they're resistant, they're disengaged, right? And so, oftentimes, when we see organizational dysfunction, I call that out simply as work avoidance. We're simply avoiding the work. It's not personal. Individuals have been trained to think this way, they've been taught to fear. Right? They've been indoctrinated, quote, terrible word, but into a culture that is not effective. And so when we find patterns of work avoidance, particularly if we're new executives coming into a difficult environment, we have to call that out. We have to name the elephants in the room, which is a leadership practice, by the way, name the elephants in the room and effectively help people avoid work avoidance. In other words, we have to help them do the real work. And what's interesting is that when you create organizational culture that is focused on the real work, then these sidebar elements actually begin to diminish. They happen in every
Mm.
organization, even in high performance organization. We will have patterns of work avoidance. The question becomes: are those patterns overly disruptive or problematic for real results? And so we can talk about tightly coupled or loosely coupled systems. But the point is, I think, to the question, is that we have to very quickly highlight and arrest patterns of work avoidance. And we do that typically through purpose, through clarity and focus of purpose. Hope that helps. It's kind of a generic answer to a broad-based question, but I'll
And
just
it's stimulating so much conversation in the chat, including, I know I said it was only two more questions, but I think we may be able to squeeze in now two, and then we will wrap up, Max.
okay,
So we can
great.
have
Yeah,
you for another
sure,
8 minutes or so.
sure,
Um, Mikey is asking, or Mickey is asking, and I'm going to coalesce that with Tamar's question
sure.
about what is a successful leader? If you had, I know you talked about your crystal ball and so on and seeing into the future. Five
Yeah,
years from now, given AI, given
yeah,
I think it was your second slide showing the
yeah,
progression and the rapidly declining segments between generations and development
yeah.
and innovations down to 76 days. I know my thought, and that's going to be a different seminar altogether about misinformation and disinformation in that 76 days.
Yeah,
But
yeah,
getting back to Mikey's question, how do you define a successful leader 5 years from now?
yeah,
What will a successful leader look like? And how do those leaders encourage the growth of the organizations, even
yeah.
though some of what the behaviors that we're talking about in a traditionalist way may seem to be negative. So rather than applauding leaders who are in the transference stage, it's seen as weakness to those around them and underneath them as well. So what does a successful
Great
leader look
question.
like? And
Yeah.
Tamar's question about how do you continue the work?
Yeah, so I think there's a simple answer, but simple does not mean it's not complex. And so, this chart, which highlights what we talked about before, that leadership is fundamentally a behavior, effectively deviates from 90% of leadership literature in the marketplace. Most leadership literature is about what we call trait theory, which is to say that if we just take the top, quote, 10 executives or best leaders in the world, and we just look at their traits, oh, they're honest, or they have charisma, or in the case of, US executives, they tend to be white men that are over 6 foot too. I mean, you could actually look at that as a trait theory issue, right? Um,
Yeah.
is that effective? Wrong. No, no, because leadership has to be context relevant and behavioral. So I think if there's a short answer to this question, a successful leader in 5 years does the following, and this is my favorite definition of leadership. They disappoint others at a rate that those people can sustain. They disappoint others at a rate that is sustainable. Now, if that offends you, the idea of leadership disappointing people, then replace disappointment with the idea of challenge. Leadership challenges others at a rate that
Mm.
they can sustain. And so, simple answer, right? But if you're an executive in a difficult position or an environment or a company that's changing radically, my gosh, that will require experimentation because we're not going to get it right every single time. We don't know the answers. As we make this progress happen around integrated learning, we have to experiment. And when we experiment, right, we find out what stimulus in the environment and what diagnostic approach is necessary. How do we get on the balcony to assess whether our interventions are effectively disruptive? The great book for some of you that want some examples on this, written by one of my mentors, Richard Pascal, called The Power of Positive Deviance. And it's the idea that, right, disruption and innovation come from an experimental approach toward human behavior change. So at the end of the day, right, all of us that run organizations have an interest in shaping human behavior. So when we can spend time on understanding, deploying against, and motivating that behavior, then typically we improve our capacity to lead. So I hope that answers the question. It's a broad answer, but.
And on that note, Max, because we could continue this conversation
I
for
love this.
another couple of hours,
Yeah.
just to give you some awareness of what went on in the chat as well. Janine Ferguson talked about corporate governance and the tone at the top and the
Mhm.
legacy leaders with long tenure and adverse influence. So that what Daniel had started that conversation, so that started with Daniel's question, and how do you balance or heal the organization after you have a leader that really did not progress the organization beyond their individual goals,
Yeah. Yeah. Well
rather than
said.
supporting the development of others. And
Yes.
self-leadership, that promoted Lisa talking about self-leadership and then others identifying with that. And finally, Janelle's talking about, and I will leave you with this quote and then ask you to wrap up. I believe leadership comes from within, regular self-evaluation and getting feedback from those who you manage, effective communication and mentorship. And I'm going to toss, we talk about cricket here rather than baseball. So I'm tossing you, right? I'm bowling that cricket ball to you and asking you then to respond.
Great. Well, what a pleasure to enter into this conversation with those of you that are deeply considering what it takes to lead at scale. We think about leadership not as outside in always, but as sometimes inside out. So for
Mhm.
Janelle's comment here, you're right, Janelle, that it actually starts internally, right? If we can understand our own motives and behaviors, if we can come to terms with how we progress and change our own behavior, then actually it's a toolkit to support outside in intervention as well in organizational life. And one final note, real briefly, this idea that letting go and transferring, as you can see on the screen here, is a soft thing to do. I want to arrest that idea. Letting go and transferring can be extremely demanding, right? So if you think about folks in your life that have made a big difference, it wasn't a layup, right? To use a basketball metaphor, they weren't asking you to be soft. They were stretching you. They were proactively pushing you to do more reps in the gym. They wanted you to sweat, right? So this idea of letting go and transferring being a practice, a set of practices that support stretch and resilience is critical to this idea of growth. So, Sonia, what a pleasure. Thank you so much for your time. I'll stay on for another minute or two if it's helpful, but really appreciate the conversation. Great questions, great interactive session. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Max. So first, I want to thank our audience, our participants, for staying this course with us, spending some time, some of you from morning to afternoon, some of you in the morning, some in the afternoon, depending on where you were joining around the globe. And thank you so much for the engagement. I think it was thought-provoking for me, at least, Max. You may have seen this before, but I thought the questions and the comments were really thought-provoking and stimulating for the discussion that we were having. So some of you are asking about the slides. We do have a curated, our tech team is going to get the recording and curate some of the content from that. So you'll be seeing that come out as well. And Matt, I want to thank the tech team for supporting us and Bridget and the others as well. And Max, I will be seeing you in November, just in a couple of weeks
Great.
in Miami when we are doing the Executive Edge, that strategic leadership program that's in person. So not, we finally met over Zoom, but looking forward to seeing you in person
Likewise.
November 12th through 14th in Miami and really engaging more deeply with the conversation that we've started here today.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Sonia. Thanks to all for your great contributions.
Okay. And with that, we're going to bring a close to today's webinar, Leading Beyond the Horizon. We hope, and I think we're getting some comments and feedback that it was beyond thought-provoking. It was very progressive as well. So thank you, Max, for your insights. And again, looking forward to seeing you in November. Thank you, participants. Thank you, team. Have a great afternoon or morning, depending on where you are.